Hi everybody. So let's see the practical project we are going to develop in the next couple of lessons. So the coding is in the background and this is the coding you will be learning. And when you run this app, you will see a dynamic user interface generated. What I mean by a dynamic user interface is, let's say if the user select a question like what is your gender, then it dynamically generates the user interface. And if the user select a choice and click next, it will dynamically figure out what the choice and store it. Let's say it stores it. And let's say if you select another question like what are the banks you are dealing with, then it shows a different set of user interfaces generated dynamically where the user can select, let's say, the options and click next, and then those options are again written or saved for future reference. And let's say if the user select what is your name, then it dynamically generates the UI. And let's say the user can type something from the keyboard and click next, and then that value is stored once again. So this practical will show you how to develop a dynamic user interface and how to access the dynamic user interface elements dynamically. When I say access dynamically, because when you click the next button, you don't know whether it can be a checkbox list or it can be radio buttons or it can be something else. So that is what I mean. When you click the next button, you will learn how to dynamically figure it out, whether it's a checkbox or radio buttons and likewise. So this is a very simple exercise, but it's very powerful and it will give you advanced knowledge about dynamic user interface developments. So we are very excited to develop this app, and now let's go and develop this app. Hi everyone. So welcome to Dynamic UI Simple Example Part 2, the continuation from the previous Part 1. We'll be using these tools for this lecture and make sure you have done these prerequisites. So this is the continuation of the previous lesson. So have a look at the previous lesson for you to understand these bullet points. So let's go and continue the practical demonstration which we were doing. So up what we have done up to now in the previous lesson is we have this user interface and we are trying to create a dynamic user interface. So basically when we select from the drop down, let's say if I select a checkbox, I want to display a checkbox, and if I select radio button, so we have to continue this from the previous lesson. So now let's see how we can finish this and continue and finish this part. So now what we are going to do is to tackle or to handle the click event of this drop down. So when I click on a checkbox, let's say I want to, on this label, I want to say checkbox clicked. When I click on radio button, let's say I want to say radio button clicked. So how do you do it? So for that, if I click on the drop down and if I go to the property palette, at the moment you are in properties, look at my mouse in the properties, and next to properties, if you look at my mouse where I'm moving my mouse, there is events. So if I click on events, then there are events action called, let's say, selected index change. So if I double click on this selected index change, what this means is selected index change. So now it auto generated the event code, but for me to explain what this is, this means when I run this and when the drop down comes, let's say if I run this and when the drop down loads, now by default it has selected an item, right? So now if I select another one, what's happening is if I click, it's changing the index of the selected item or of the drop down. If I select another item, it's the index of the selected item changes. So that is that is what this event is, selected index change. So that way you can, if you override this method, and I mean if you write the code inside this code will trigger every time you select a item from the drop down, because every time you select item, the selected item's index is changed. So let's say I want to put a general message to the LBL answer dot text. Let's say I want to say drop down clicked. Okay, drop down clicked. So I just want to see whether it works. So now let's run and see whether it 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 works. Right, we'll see whether it works. So if I click on an item, so you can see that event is not triggered, right? I mean it's not working. So now we will have to see why that event is not triggered or not working. So let's see what we have to do for that now. So there are multiple ways of solving that issue. One of the way of solving that issue is you can either do it from the property palette or you can go to the source code, and for the drop down, right, for this drop down, because that is where you try to trigger this event, as a property you can put this which is auto pause back true. Now in part 1 I explain you what is pause back, right? So in the previous lesson, so auto pause back true means by default for a drop down, when you click a drop down, that pause back is not enabled. So what you have to do is you have to say auto pause back equals to true. This will enable the automatic pause back when you click on the drop down. So now if I run this and if I click on an item, so you can see now it says drop down clicked. If I click the button, it says button clicked. If I click the drop down, it says drop down clicked. So what's happening now is, because I enable auto pause back true, so every time I click an item, it will trigger a pause back. So in the previous lesson I explained to you pause back means it's reloading the page, and then when it's reloading the page, it will also figure out that you have clicked the item, so that it will trigger this event and also your event will work. So that is a trick you have to do to make your event trigger. So now you know that your event is triggered, right? Meaning when you click on it, you know it's working. So now what you want to do is, let's say I want to find which item is clicked, whether I clicked on the text box, or whether I clicked on radio button, or whether I clicked on the checkbox, because there are 3 items, right? So I want to know which one was selected. So now let's do that part. So what this so this is the line you will be putting for that. So what this line does is, from the drop down list 1, there's a property called selected item. So if I just show it to you, input drop down list dot selected item, a property, and from that you can select the text, meaning whatever the text of that selected item in the drop down. And as you can see, it returns a string. If you look here, it says this returns a string. So that is why after calling this text, I'm going to store it in a string. So now what I can do is I can put a if condition and find what the text value is. So I'm going to say if it is a text box, because in the list you can see either the text, it's a text box or checkbox, right? So this way you can figure out which item has been clicked. Then you can say else if it is checkbox, do this likewise. So if it is text box, then instead of telling just a general drop down click, what I want to do is I would like to say, okay, text box selected. Okay, so I would like to say text box selected. So then this is the code you will be writing. You will say text box selected or checkbox or radio button. So this is how you know which item is selected. So if I run this now, and if I select checkbox, it says checkbox selected. So now you know how to tackle you know how to find which item is clicked from the drop down. Okay, awesome. So now my next step is, instead of just telling what is selected, I want to dynamically create a checkbox. If I click on radio button, I want to dynamically create a radio button. So because our focus in this lesson is about dynamic UI creation. So now let's see how to do that part. So for you to dynamically create user interface components, I'm going to go next to the drop down and press the enter key and create some space, because I'm going to, so how for you to do that, you will put a component called placeholder. So placeholder is a container where you can dynamically add or display other user interface components. So I'm putting a placeholder. And what is a placeholder? Why I'm putting a placeholder is, now I can programmatically display a checkbox inside this placeholder, or display a text box inside this placeholder, or display a radio button, or any component. So placeholder is a container or small component which is a container where you can display other components inside it dynamically. So now let's give a ID for this placeholder, because I need to refer it. So it has an ID called placeholder1, and let's keep that, okay, without changing. So now I'm going to my coding, and whenever I select text box, I want to dynamically create a text box and then display that text box. So how this is the dynamic UI creation actually. Now what I'm going to do now is the heart of this lesson, or the core of this lesson, called dynamic UI creation. Everything else I did up to now is just to create the other, part of this web app, because we can't just do dynamic UI. You need some events, you need something to happen. So what I did up to now is just the basic events, and now only I'm starting the dynamic UI creation. I with the dynamic UI creation start with the placeholder, which I did now, and after the placeholder, the next thing is you have to dynamically create the text box. Simple as that. You dynamically create the text box, and then into the placeholder you can add it. Just creating is not enough, and now we have a placeholder. So you put this command, so it's placeholder1 dot controls dot add. So this is how you dynamically add a component into a placeholder. In this case, it's a text box. Now let's run this and see the output, right? We'll see the output. So now if I, let's say, create checkbox, it just says checkbox here, but if I click text box, you can see it dynamically creates a text box. This is the heart of this lesson, and this is the most important aspect of this lesson. So now let's say hi all, whatever it is. So now let's do it for the, like we did for the text box. Now let's do the same thing for a checkbox, right? So if you want to do it for a checkbox, then you have to dynamically create a checkbox. So this is how you create a checkbox object. And then that's not enough. For the checkbox, you have to add some items, right? You have to add some items. So let's say if I want to add some items, this is the command you have to use to add items. So you create a checkbox object, and then to that checkbox object, you can access the items property and say add, and then you have to add a new list item, and this is the item which will get added. So there will be 4 checkboxes. Then as usual, the next thing is for you to add this checkbox into the placeholder. It's very important to add it to the placeholder for you to display dynamically. And then let's do the same thing for a radio button as well. So then we can run the app with that as well. So for radio button, you will create a radio button list object, and then you will do the same thing what you did for a checkbox, and you will add the items like this. So these are just standard commands. You create a radio button list object and add items. Let's say male and female radio button. And then like earlier, you have to add the radio button object into the placeholder, right? Then only it will dynamically display. So now let's run this, and now it should display not only a text box, it should also display, if I select a checkbox, as you can see now it displays those 4 checkboxes. This is what this is the most important thing you need to know from this lesson. Dynamic UI creation. Can you see the radio buttons are dynamically created? This is dynamic UI creation. So the text box is created dynamically. Dynamically means whenever you need it only. It's not fixed. So that is the idea here, right? So it will create the checkboxes only when it's needed, right? For example, right? Now instead of putting it as radio button or text box, you can put it as a question. You can say, instead of text box, you can say what is your name, and then instead of that you can say what are the banks you are using. You can say what is the gender, likewise. And when you select let's say what are the banks you are using, you can display. So this is the dynamic UI creation, and you successfully learn about dynamic UI creation. So what we are going to do next is we will be adding more features to this, and we will make a complete data driven application. So make sure to look at the remaining parts of this lesson. So far you learn about dynamic UI, you learn about how to create a UI dynamically, you learn about adding components dynamically, but this one, finding and accessing, we haven't done yet. We will be doing it in the next lesson. Placeholders, adding you did, but find control we'll be doing in the next lesson. And view state also we'll be covering in the next lesson. So we use these references for this lecture, and look at the next part of this for you to complete this simple exercise, and also for you to see how to do a complete project. So let's meet in the next lesson.